Dedicate the whole program today, not only to everyone who died on September 11th, but to everyone who has died through violence everywhere. It's a horrible way to end this life. It's a horrible thing to do to others. So I'd like us to pray both for the victims of violence and those who commit violence, because they are creating the causes for horrible suffering for themselves later. So please keep that in mind during the program today. Thank you very much.
Precepts incense, concentration incense, wisdom incense, liberation incense, liberation of views incense, cloud of lighted incense pouring into the Dharma realms, offering to the three jewels of the 10 directions. Namo incense offering Bodhisattva. Namo incense offering Bodhisattva. Namo incense offering Bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to all the directions of space, realms past, present, and future, the 10 directions, all Buddhas, honor Dharma, the enlightened Sangha, the eternal region. I respectfully bow to the Dharma Master, world Sakyamuni Buddha, the future Buddha Maitreya, wisdom unto Sri Bodhisattva, great practice Samantapaka, Dharma protector, Bodhisattvas, Buddhas, and Bodhisattvas, assembling at the great holy mountain. I respectfully bow to great love and great compassion, Western Paradise, Amida Buddha, great compassion, Avalokitesvara Bodhisattva, great power, Mahasamabhrata Bodhisattva, Siddhivaka Bodhisattva, and the Bodhisattvas in the pure ocean.
So we're talking about the Four Noble Truths today. This is, of course, the first teaching of the Buddha. So after the Buddha's enlightenment, he went back to the 5 ascetics, the 5 monks who were meditating in the forest. And this is the first teaching that he gave. You've probably heard this in the life story of the Buddha, but when he left them, when he left these 5 monks, they thought that he'd given up. They're like, oh, that Gautama, you know, this is the Buddha's other name, Siddhartha Gautama. Oh, he's given up, he's weak. But then when they saw him approaching, when he was coming back after his enlightenment, oh yes, that will look much nicer, thanks. After his enlightenment, at first they said, oh, here comes that lazy Gautama, we're going to ignore him. But as he approached, they saw that there was something different about him. And this is the first teaching that he gave him. So this is ultimately what everything in Buddhism is based on, these 4 noble truths. So it's important to understand them clearly. Don't worry, at the end of each, like number 1 here, existence of suffering and dissatisfaction, dukkha is the word there. This is the Pali word for suffering and dissatisfaction. You don't really have to know these, I just put them there. So this is what we call the truth of suffering. That our existence is pervaded, is the basic truth of our existing is dissatisfaction and suffering. So this word dukkha is traditionally translated as just suffering, but that's sometimes too strong of a word in English. It actually has this kind of range of meanings, everything from dissatisfaction all the way up to suffering, okay? And the history of this word, or what it's connected to words meaning things like a wheel that's off its axle, or a bone that's out of joint. Something's not right, okay? So we suffer in many different ways, specifically through birth, old age, sickness, and death. You also know from the life story of the Buddha that he left the palace. His father tried to protect him from suffering. And so the story is that he went out from the palace and he saw birth, old age, sickness, and death. And then he saw what we call in English a mendicant, like a wandering kind of holy man. And that made him think, well, there are people who are trying to find a way out of all this. I should try to find a way too. And that's what set him on his path. So he started by seeing this truth, but then he really, in his enlightenment, it became more than just an idea. It became more than just an intellectual thought. He really understood it. This was his enlightenment. So also, suffering is not getting what we want and having to deal with what we don't want. This is also suffering and dissatisfaction. This is what we do every minute of every day. If we really think about it, everything we do is about getting happiness, getting what we want, and avoiding what we don't want. Really, right? Every thought at work, oh no, here's that person I don't want to talk to. Oh, the phone just rang, you know? Or it's even a half thought. Driving to work, oh, I really want to get a latte at Starbucks. Or something like that. It's these little things. Everything that we do throughout the day is about getting happiness and avoiding suffering. And if we think about it, even insects, animals, are essentially doing the same thing. They're trying to meet their needs so that they're not hungry, so that they're not in pain, so that they're comfortable as they can be. This is what all beings are trying to do. So there's some technical information here. There are 3 different kinds of suffering. There's, if you have a pen or something, you're welcome to write these things down. There's the suffering of suffering. And it's very descriptive, right? The suffering of suffering. This is really obvious suffering. You lose your job, you get sick, your parents die, you stub your toe, right? Obvious suffering. This one's really easy. And then there's the suffering of change. So this is having what we like and kind of losing it over time. So we say that the suffering of change is pleasant when it arises, right? Pleasant when it arises, pleasant when it remains, and then suffering when it goes away. So we get what we like and it's nice while we have it, but then we lose it and we suffer. This is the suffering of change. And we all experience this throughout our lives. We've got a good thing going at work for a while, but then we get a new boss and we don't like them and our good situation is gone, and so we suffer. Or we're in a new relationship, right? We're in a new relationship, well, not me, I'm a monk, but yeah, well, friendships even, not just romantic relationships. Let's say romantic relationships for you all, friendships for me. So you're in a relationship and everything's nice, and then it's not. Okay, so, and then we see this also over the course of our lives. Right now, I'm young, I'm a little overweight, but I'm relatively healthy. But then eventually, you know, my grandfather is 92, 93 years old now. He's slowly dying of congestive heart failure. Right? He also had cancer a few years ago. My father had a bout with cancer. He's going blind, and he has Parkinson's disease. So I will probably also eventually get cancer, and there's a pretty good chance, genetically, I could have the same problem with blindness and Parkinson's. My dad's also, for a while, he was borderline diabetic because he wasn't very healthy. This is why I go for walks. I'm trying to do some more exercise now so I can avoid that. But so eventually, I mean, most of us here are relatively young and we're healthy. Eventually, we won't be. This is just the nature of having a body. Right? So this is the suffering of change. And then there's what we call all-pervasive suffering, suffering that runs throughout our whole existence. So this is, well, you know, like in the Heart Sutra when we're chanting, we mention the skandhas, the 5 skandhas. Okay, I'm not going to go into this today. I'm going to talk about this in a later lesson. The simplest way to put it is just the very fact that we are unenlightened means that there is suffering. It's inevitably going to come. It's going to keep coming, keep coming. We get bits of happiness. We experience happiness, but it goes away, and suffering comes. So this is what we mean by all-pervasive suffering. It's just because we are these ignorant, temporary beings, inevitably suffering comes. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about all-pervasive suffering. Okay. So that is the truth of suffering. Existence is suffering. Now, a lot of times, non-Buddhists hear this, or people new to Buddhism hear this, and they're like, man, these Buddhists are depressing. Forget this. Let's go to a club and have a beer. You know, I've actually had people say these kinds of things to me before. I don't want anything to do with this Buddhism, all this focus on suffering, ugh. But you've probably heard me say before that we are very much like addicts. We're constantly grabbing at bits of happiness, right? This is what an addict is basically doing. They're trying to cover up their suffering with drugs or alcohol. And we just do it with other things, more socially acceptable things. Money, entertainment, and so on and so forth. So what is the first thing that we say for someone who is an addict? What's the first step to recovery? Yes, admit the problem. That's what the First Noble Truth is about. We're simply recognizing we've got a problem. We've got this problem of suffering. Okay, so now what do we do? The Second Noble Truth is then the origin of suffering. So at this Pali word at the end here, samudaya, means origin. So we experience this suffering and dissatisfaction because of ignorance. We don't see clearly, and therefore suffering comes.